Refueling seems like the simplest task in motorcycle ownership. Pull up to the pump, fill the tank, ride away. But small habits at the gas station add up over years of ownership, quietly wearing down fuel pumps, injectors, and seals long before their time. Here are 9 refueling mistakes that could be shortening your motorcycle's life without you ever realizing it. Mistake number 1. Running the tank near empty on a regular basis. Many riders treat the low fuel light as a countdown timer rather than a genuine warning, routinely riding until the tank is nearly dry before finally stopping to refuel. On motorcycles with an in-tank electric fuel pump, which describes the vast majority of fuel-injected bikes sold today, the fuel itself plays a critical role in cooling and lubricating the pump's internal components. Running consistently low means the pump spends more time drawing from a shallow reserve, sometimes pulling in air alongside fuel, which causes it to run hotter and wear faster than a pump that always has a healthy volume of fuel surrounding it. Over time, this habit shortens fuel pump lifespan meaningfully, and fuel pump replacement is rarely a cheap or simple repair, often requiring partial fuel tank removal and several hours of labor. Sediment and debris that naturally settle at the bottom of a fuel tank over months and years of use also become more likely to get drawn into the fuel system when the tank runs low, since there is less clean fuel above the sediment layer to keep it undisturbed. A simple habit change, refueling once the tank reaches roughly a quarter full rather than pushing to the last few miles of range, costs almost nothing in convenience but meaningfully extends the service life of components that are genuinely expensive to replace once they fail. Riders who tour extensively or commute long distances daily are especially prone to this habit simply because they cover enough miles that stopping earlier feels like a genuine inconvenience compared to squeezing out every last mile of range. A useful mental shortcut is treating the low fuel warning light not as a hard deadline, but as a signal that was already calibrated with a safety margin built in, meaning the actual mileage remaining once it illuminates is typically less than riders assume. Fuel pumps on many modern motorcycles are also not designed to be user-serviceable in isolation, meaning a failed pump often requires replacing the entire assembly rather than a simple internal repair, which further raises the real financial cost of a habit that feels harmless in the moment but adds up over years of ownership. Keeping a simple mental or written log of typical range on a full tank also helps riders spot a developing fuel system problem early, since a noticeable drop in achievable range without a change in riding style often signals a fuel delivery issue worth investigating before it worsens. Mistake number 2. Using the wrong octane fuel for your engine. Every motorcycle manufacturer specifies a minimum octane rating for good reason, and both using fuel below that rating and assuming more expensive premium fuel is always better can cause real problems. Using fuel with a lower octane rating than the engine requires can cause knocking or pinging under load, a condition where fuel ignites prematurely inside the cylinder rather than at the intended moment, creating pressure spikes that stress pistons, rings, and bearings over repeated cycles. Modern fuel-injected motorcycles with NOx sensors can often compensate somewhat by retarding ignition timing, but that compensation typically costs some performance and can mask an underlying problem rather than solving it. On the other end, some riders assume that using higher octane premium fuel than their bike actually provides some kind of performance or cleanliness benefit, which for most engines simply is not true. Octane rating measures a fuel's resistance to premature ignition, not its cleaning additives or overall quality, and an engine designed for regular fuel gains no meaningful benefit from unnecessarily expensive premium fuel beyond what the owner's manual specifies. The fix here is straightforward. Check the owner's manual for the manufacturer's actual octane requirement and stick to it consistently, rather than guessing or assuming that more expensive fuel is automatically better for long-term engine health. Riders who frequently tow, carry heavy loads, or ride aggressively in hot climates should pay particularly close attention to octane requirements, since these conditions increase cylinder temperatures and combustion pressures, making the engine more susceptible to knock if the fuel's octane rating is only marginally adequate under normal conditions. It is also worth noting that octane ratings are measured differently between regions, with the research octane number system common in Europe reading several points higher than the anti-knock index number typically posted on North American pumps for what is chemically the same fuel. So riders who travel internationally should double-check regional labeling conventions rather than assuming the numbers translate directly. Riders unsure of their specific motorcycle's octane requirement should check the fuel filler door or cap area directly, since many manufacturers stamp or label the minimum required octane rating right at the point of refueling rather than only in the owner's manual. Mistake number 3. Ignoring ethanol content, especially on older bikes. Most gas stations now sell fuel blended with up to 10% ethanol, commonly labeled E10, and some regions offer even higher ethanol blends like E15. For newer motorcycles specifically engineered with ethanol-compatible fuel system components, this generally causes no significant problems. But older motorcycles, particularly those built before the mid-2000s with rubber fuel lines, gaskets, and carburetor components not designed with ethanol resistance in mind, face real degradation risk from regular exposure to ethanol-blended fuel. Ethanol is also hygroscopic, meaning it actively absorbs moisture from the surrounding air, and that absorbed water can settle at the bottom of a fuel tank or carburetor bowl, contributing to corrosion and rough running over time, particularly on bikes that sit for extended periods between rides. Carbureted motorcycles are especially vulnerable since ethanol-blended fuel left sitting in a carburetor bowl for weeks can leave behind a gummy varnish residue as the fuel breaks down, clogging tiny jets that are expensive and time-consuming to clean or replace. Riders with an older or carbureted motorcycle should seek out ethanol-free fuel where it is available, commonly sold at marinas and some independent gas stations specifically because boat engines face similar ethanol-related concerns, or at minimum should treat every tank with a fuel stabilizer if the bike will sit for more than a few weeks between rides. Some regions have specifically labeled ethanol-free fuel pumps, often marketed towards small engine equipment, boats, and classic vehicles, and seeking these out for an older or carbureted motorcycle, even at a modest price premium, is frequently cheaper in the long run than the eventual cost of cleaning or rebuilding a carburetor clogged with ethanol-related varnish buildup. Riders storing a carbureted bike for the season should also consider draining the carburetor float bowls entirely rather than relying on stabilizer alone, since even treated fuel sitting directly in a carburetor for many months presents more risk than fuel sitting in a sealed tank. A quick online search for a specific model's known ethanol sensitivity, since some enthusiast forums have compiled detailed accounts of which carburetor jets or fuel line materials are most prone to ethanol-related degradation on particular older bikes. Mistake number 4. Overfilling the tank past the fill neck. It is tempting to squeeze in every last drop when refueling, especially when trying to maximize range before a long ride. But overfilling a motorcycle's fuel tank past the base of the fill neck causes real problems that are not immediately obvious. Fuel expands as it warms, whether from ambient temperature increases on a hot day or simply from engine heat radiating into the tank during a ride. And a completely full tank with no room for that expansion can push fuel out through the tank's vent system, wasting fuel and creating a genuine fire hazard if it happens near a hot exhaust component. Overfilling also puts additional pressure on the fuel cap seal and the tank's vent hose, and rubber components exposed to seeping fuel over time can degrade and crack faster than they otherwise would, eventually leading to leaks that are more expensive and more hazardous to fix than the minor convenience of a slightly fuller tank was ever worth. Most motorcycle fuel tanks are actually designed with dead airspace specifically for this reason, and manufacturers typically indicate this by having fuel reach the base of the filler neck rather than the very top, which some riders mistake for the pump automatically shutting off too early rather than the intended safe fill level. Manufacturers also design the dead airspace in a fuel tank to account for a motorcycle being parked on its side stand. which naturally tilts the bike and can shift the effective fuel level relative to the tank's true capacity, meaning a completely topped-off tank on level ground may already be closer to genuinely full than a rider expects once the bike leans onto its stand in a parking spot. Overfilling incidents that spill fuel across bodywork can also cause tank decals and paint clear coat to lift or discolor over time, an entirely avoidable cosmetic problem that stems purely from an extra few seconds at the pump squeezing in fuel the tank was never designed to hold. Riders can perform a simple visual check by removing the fuel cap after a fill and observing whether fuel sits right at the base of the filler neck rather than significantly higher, using that observation to calibrate their own sense of a proper safe fill level going forward. Mistake number 5. Letting fuel sit for months without a stabilizer. Gasoline is a genuinely unstable chemical mixture, and it begins breaking down chemically within just a few weeks of being pumped from the refinery, a process that accelerates further once ethanol content is added into the mix. Riders who park a motorcycle for winter storage or simply ride infrequently and leave the tank sitting with old, untreated fuel are inviting a whole category of problems that show up the next time they try to start the bike. Stale fuel can leave behind a varnish-like residue as its more volatile components evaporate, and that residue clogs carburetor jets on older bikes or on fuel-injected models can gum up injector nozzles enough to cause rough idling, hard starting, or a genuine no-start condition after an extended period of storage. A fuel stabilizer additive added to a full tank before storage begins meaningfully slows this chemical breakdown process and keeps fuel usable for several months rather than just a few weeks, protecting the entire fuel system from the buildup and corrosion that stale fuel otherwise causes. The additional step of actually running the engine for several minutes after adding stabilizer rather than just pouring it into the tank ensures the treated fuel circulates through the carburetor or injectors and lines rather than only protecting the fuel sitting in the tank itself. Fuel stabilizer products vary somewhat in their exact chemistry and recommended treatment ratios, so riders should follow the specific product's instructions rather than assuming a generic capful is always sufficient, since under-treating a full tank provides meaningfully less protection than the product is actually capable of delivering when used correctly. For riders storing a motorcycle for particularly long periods, 6 months or more, some experts additionally recommend using a fuel stabilizer combined with periodically starting the engine every few weeks if practical, which keeps treated fuel circulating and moving parts lubricated rather than sitting completely static for the entire storage period. Purchasing fuel stabilizer in a size proportional to actual storage needs, rather than a large bottle that itself ages on a garage shelf for years between uses, ensures the product retains its full effectiveness when it is finally needed for seasonal storage. Mistake number 6. Ignoring the fuel cap vent or breather system. Nearly every motorcycle fuel tank includes some form of venting system, whether a small vent hole built into the cap itself or a separate vent hose routed away from the tank. And this system exists specifically to let air into the tank as fuel is consumed, preventing a vacuum from forming that would otherwise starve the fuel pump or carburetor of fuel. Riders rarely think about this system until it fails, typically after dirt, debris, or an aftermarket cap that does not match the original vent design blocks it partially or completely. A blocked vent creates a growing vacuum inside the tank as fuel is used, and that vacuum can eventually restrict fuel flow enough to cause stalling, hesitation, or a noticeable loss of power that many riders initially mistake for a more serious engine problem. Periodically checking that the vent hole or hose is clear of dirt, spider webs, or corrosion, particularly on bikes that spend time parked outdoors or in dusty environments, is a genuinely quick and free maintenance check that prevents a frustrating and sometimes hard to diagnose running problem down the road. Riders who install aftermarket fuel caps for styling reasons should specifically confirm the replacement includes a properly functioning vent system, since some purely cosmetic aftermarket caps skip this feature entirely. On motorcycles where the vent system routes through a small hose rather than a cap-integrated vent, riders should periodically trace that hose's full length during routine maintenance to confirm it has not become pinched, kinked, or blocked at any point along its routing, since damage or blockage partway along the hose produces the same fuel starvation symptoms as a blocked vent directly at the cap itself. Riders who notice a hissing sound when first opening the fuel cap, or conversely notice the cap seems difficult to remove as though sealed by suction, should treat that as a clear sign the venting system needs immediate attention rather than something to address later. A small pick or piece of wire kept in a toolkit specifically for clearing a blocked vent hole in the field can turn a frustrating roadside mystery into a 2-minute fix for any rider who understands what symptom to look for in the first place. Mistake number 7. Mixing old stale fuel with fresh fuel. When a motorcycle has been sitting for an extended period with old fuel in the tank, the instinct for many riders is simply to add fresh fuel on top, rather than draining the old fuel out completely first. This seems like a reasonable shortcut, but it dilutes rather than eliminates the problem, since the varnish, oxidized fuel components, and any accumulated moisture from the old fuel remain in the tank and mix with the fresh fuel, rather than being removed entirely. The resulting blend still carries degraded fuel properties and potential contaminants throughout the fuel system, meaning the bike may still run roughly, or experience fuel delivery problems even after adding what the rider assumes is a full tank of good fuel. For a bike that has sat for more than 2 or 3 months without stabilizer treatment, the more thorough approach is draining the old fuel completely, ideally disposing of it properly at a hazardous waste facility rather than pouring it into a vehicle and starting fresh with clean, properly stabilized fuel. This extra step takes more time than simply topping off the tank, but it genuinely protects the fuel system from the compounding effects of degraded fuel components that a simple top-off does nothing to actually remove from circulation. Riders should also resist the temptation to add a fuel system cleaner additive on top of old, degraded fuel as a substitute for actually draining it, since these products are formulated to maintain and clean a system already running on reasonably fresh fuel, not to reverse the chemical breakdown that has already occurred in fuel that has been sitting for months. Properly disposing of drained old fuel matters as much as removing it in the first place, since pouring gasoline down a drain or onto the ground creates genuine environmental contamination that most regions have specific hazardous waste disposal procedures in place to prevent. Riders can mark fuel containers or note fill dates directly when adding fuel to long-term storage, creating a simple visual reminder of how old any remaining fuel actually is before deciding whether topping off is appropriate or a full drain is the safer choice. Mistake number 8. Refueling with a hot engine or near ignition sources. Gasoline vapor is highly flammable, considerably more so than the liquid fuel itself, and refueling a motorcycle with a still hot engine or exhaust system creates a genuine safety hazard that many riders underestimate simply because they have gotten away with it before without incident. Fuel spilled or splashed near a hot exhaust pipe during refueling can ignite almost instantly, and even fuel vapor alone without any visible spill can find an ignition source on a sufficiently hot engine component. Beyond the immediate safety risk, repeatedly refueling with a hot engine increases the likelihood of small fuel spills evaporating quickly against hot components, leaving behind residue that can affect paint finish and, over years of repeated exposure, degrade rubber seals, wiring insulation, and plastic bodywork positioned near the fuel filler area. The safer practice is allowing the motorcycle to cool for several minutes after a ride before refueling, which also happens to reduce the amount of fuel vapor escaping from the tank during the fill process itself, since cooler fuel and a cooler tank both produce less vapor pressure. This is a minor inconvenience, adding perhaps 5 or 10 minutes to a fuel stop, in exchange for meaningfully reducing both an immediate safety risk and a slower cumulative source of cosmetic and component wear around the fuel filler area. Riders should also be mindful of static electricity as a genuine ignition risk during refueling, particularly in dry climates, since a static discharge from clothing or the fuel container itself can ignite fuel vapor just as effectively as a hot exhaust component, which is part of why many fuel stations post reminders about touching a grounded metal surface before handling the fuel nozzle. Beyond the engine cooling down, choosing to refuel away from other potential ignition sources, including running vehicles nearby or lit cigarettes, further reduces cumulative risk during a task that most riders perform on autopilot without thinking through the actual fire safety principles involved. Many riding gear manufacturers now include small grounding straps or conductive materials in gloves specifically marketed toward reducing static buildup, a detail worth considering for riders who frequently refuel in particularly dry or cold climates where static risk runs highest. Mistake number 9. Neglecting the fuel filter and fuel lines. Most motorcycles include a fuel filter somewhere in the system, whether a small inline filter, one integrated directly into the fuel pump assembly, or a simple mesh screen at the tank's fuel pickup, and its job is straightforward: catch sediment, rust particles, and debris before they reach the carburetor or fuel injectors where they can cause real damage. Riders who never think about fuel filtration and never check or replace the filter as part of routine maintenance eventually see that debris accumulate to the point where fuel flow becomes restricted, causing hesitation, poor throttle response, or in more severe cases, a fuel-starved stall at exactly the wrong moment. Rubber fuel lines age too, becoming brittle and prone to small cracks over years of heat cycling and exposure to ethanol-blended fuels. And a cracked fuel line can develop a slow leak that is genuinely dangerous given how flammable the fuel it carries. Most manufacturers specify a fuel filter replacement interval, and following it, even on a bike that seems to be running fine, catches problems before they cause a more expensive fuel pump or injector failure downstream. A simple visual inspection of visible fuel lines for cracking, discoloration, or stiffness during routine maintenance takes only a couple of minutes and can catch a developing problem long before it turns into a roadside breakdown, a fuel leak near a hot engine component. Riders who frequently ride in dusty, sandy, or off-road environments should consider shortening their fuel filter inspection interval below the manufacturer's standard recommendation, since these conditions introduce more airborne particulate that can eventually find its way into the fuel system despite a sealed tank, accelerating filter clogging beyond what the standard maintenance schedule assumes for typical paved road riding conditions. Keeping a spare fuel filter on hand for a long-distance trip, particularly on an older motorcycle with unknown fuel line and filter history, is a small, inexpensive precaution that can prevent a minor, easily fixed problem from turning into a stranded, difficult roadside repair far from home. Riders can ask their dealer or independent mechanic to include a fuel filter and fuel line visual inspection as a standard line item during every scheduled service, ensuring the check happens consistently rather than depending on the rider remembering to request it separately each time. The bottom line: none of these 9 mistakes will destroy a motorcycle overnight, and that is exactly what makes them dangerous. They work slowly, quietly shortening the life of a fuel pump, corroding a fuel line, or leaving gummy residue in a carburetor over months and years of small, repeated habits at the gas pump. Building better refueling habits costs nothing but a little attention, and it is one of the cheapest forms of preventive maintenance available to any rider willing to actually pay attention at the pump. If this saved you from a bad purchase, subscribe for more straight talk motorcycle buying advice.